They dragged her across the square like a sack of bad grain, her bare feet scraped on the packed dirt, pebbles and grit tearing at her skin. The sun was a hammer high in the sky, beating down on the town of Redemption, but nobody felt the heat. They were all too busy watching the show. Two big men, deputies by the looks of their tarnished badges, had her by the arms, their fingers digging into her flesh like claws. Her dress, once a simple white cotton, was now just a collection of filthy rags, torn and stained with blood and dirt. She stumbled, her knees already raw and bleeding, but they just yanked her harder, forcing her toward the center of the town, where a crude wooden table waited. Behind that table stood Reverend Hale. His face was a thundercloud, his eyes burning with a holy fire that looked a lot like hate. He slammed a meaty fist on the wood, making the papers laid out there jump. "Sign it!" he roared, his voice echoing off the silent storefronts. "Sign the confession, girl! Admit you called on dark powers to blight this town!" Her name was Mara Quinn, and her hand shook so bad she could barely see it. "I will not," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "I heal with herbs. I never cursed anyone." Sheriff Caleb Pike leaned in close then, his shadow falling over her like a shroud. His breath was sour with whiskey and contempt. "You refuse to sign, girl," he growled, his voice low and menacing. "Then the rope will speak for you, and it only knows one word." Mara's lips trembled, but her eyes held a spark of defiance. "I won't curse," she said, a little louder this time. "I will only speak the truth." That was the wrong thing to say. The crowd, which had been a low murmur of voices, erupted into a chorus of jeers and shouts. Someone threw a rotten apple that splattered against her shoulder. A man in the front row spat on the ground at her feet. "She brought the fever to our children," a woman screamed from the back, her voice shrill with grief and fear. "She soured the milk and killed the cattle. Witch!" The word shot through the air like a bullet, and once it was said, it was all they could see. Reverend Hale's eyes gleamed, a mask of false righteousness hiding the satisfaction beneath. He grabbed a quill, dipped it in the inkwell, and shoved it into Mara's hand, forcing her trembling fingers to wrap around it. "Sign," he hissed. Her wrist spasmed, sending a black smear of ink across the parchment. With a sob, she dropped the quill. "I cannot write lies." That was all Sheriff Pike needed to hear. "Then let the tree take her," he declared, his voice flat and final. The deputies grabbed her again, and the nightmare started over. They dragged her away from the square, away from the accusing eyes, toward the riverbank. There, an old cottonwood tree stood alone, its branches reaching out like skeletal arms. It had been a hanging tree before, and it was about to be one again. The sun was merciless. Mara gasped for air, her lungs on fire, her body a symphony of pain. They didn't even give her the dignity of a proper noose. They tied a thick, rough rope around her waist, pulling it so tight she thought her ribs would crack. It bit into her skin, a circle of fire. They bound her wrists in front of her, lashed her ankles together. Every knot was a fresh wave of agony on her bruised and broken body. Then the men hauled on the other end of the rope. Her body was jerked off the ground, bending backward at an impossible angle as they lifted her, waist high, against a thick, low-hanging branch. Her head and arms hung down toward the earth, her feet pointing uselessly at the dirt. Her dark hair fell over her face like a curtain, hiding the world from her and her from the world. A small whimper escaped her lips, a sound so weak it was swallowed by the vast, empty silence. No one answered it. The crowd had already seen enough. Their thirst for justice, or maybe just for cruelty, had been satisfied for the day. They turned their backs, drifting away in small groups, their voices fading as they returned to their homes and their lives. They left her there, hanging like a broken doll, swaying in the hot wind under the silent judgment of the noonday sun. The old cottonwood groaned with the strain, as if it at least felt some pity for her. Tears filled her eyes, blurring the upside-down world. She thought of the children she'd treated, their fevers breaking under her cool hands. She remembered her mother's songs, sung long ago in a life that felt like a dream, songs that promised hope. But hope was a dry whisper in a parched throat now. Her lips moved, forming words no one could hear. I only wanted to heal. The sun scorched her back, sweat and blood trickled down her skin, a vile cocktail of her own suffering. Each breath was a shallow, sharp battle. Her vision started to blur, the harsh blue sky turning a blinding, hazy white. Her body sagged, all the fight draining out of her, leaving only an empty vessel of pain. Still, she whispered it one more time, a final desperate prayer to a God who wasn't listening. I won't curse. Only speak. But the town had already passed its judgment. There was no mercy in the empty streets, no kindness behind the shuttered windows. There was only silence. And in that crushing silence, Mara finally understood the truth. It wasn't about witchcraft at all. Reverend Hale feared her herbs because his own shelves were full of expensive, useless medicines that nobody wanted to buy. Sheriff Pike feared her healing because the railroad company paid him handsomely to clear the land, and sick, desperate people were easier to push out than healthy, hopeful ones. They didn't find a witch. They needed one. So they made her. The cicadas droned their relentless song from the tall grass. The river hissed and whispered below the bank. The town was gone, but its judgment hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Mara closed her eyes, ready to surrender, ready for the end. But then she heard it, a sound that didn't belong in the silence, the steady, heavy thud of hooves striking the ground, slow, deliberate, unhurried. Someone was coming. Was it another enemy, come to gloat at her suffering, or was it the one thing she no longer believed in, a friend? The rider pulled his horse to a stop right under the cottonwood. The sight that greeted him was enough to freeze the blood in a man's veins. A young woman, barely more than a girl, hanging limp from a rope, her body bent backward like a broken reed in the wind. For a long, silent moment, the man just sat there on his horse, his jaw tight, his chest heavy with a cold, hard anger. His name was Eli Barrett, and he'd seen his share of ugliness in the world, but this was different. This was a special kind of poison. He swung himself down from the saddle, his movements economical and precise. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. He just walked forward, pulled a long, sharp knife from the sheath on his belt, and with one clean, upward slash, he cut the rope. Mara collapsed. Eli caught her before she hit the ground. She was as light as a bundle of dry leaves, yet she felt like she carried the weight of the whole town's cruelty in her small frame. He laid her gently across the saddle, mounted up behind her, and turned the horse around, riding back the way he came, toward his ranch nestled in the low hills outside of town. The ride was silent, but Eli's mind was a storm. Why would a town hang a girl in broad daylight and then just leave her there to die slow? It didn't make sense. It smelled of something rotten, something deeper than a simple witch scare. By the time he reached the long, low outline of his ranch house, his shirt was soaked with sweat, and Mara's tattered dress was damp with her own blood. He carried her inside, the screen door slapping shut behind him. He laid her down on a simple cot near the cold fireplace and brought a tin cup of water from the bucket. He held it to her lips. At first, she didn't stir. He thought for a terrifying second that he was too late. Then, her eyelids fluttered. They opened wide, filled with a wild animal panic. She gasped, a raw, ragged sound, and tried to push his hand away, a weak, desperate gesture. Eli didn't move. His voice was soft but steady as a rock. "You're safe here," he said. "Drink." Her throat worked, and she took a small, shuddering swallow of water, and then another. The dam broke, and the tears came, silent tracks of grief cutting through the dirt on her face. Through cracked, swollen lips, she began to whisper. "They called me a witch. They beat me, dragged me, said I cursed the cattle, but I I only tried to heal. Eli leaned back on his heels, listening. He didn't interrupt. Her voice was shaky, broken, but there was a core of steel in it that held his attention. She told him everything. How she used sage leaves to bring down fevers in children. How she ground willow bark into a tea for the miners who coughed their lungs out after a long, hard winter. How she never took a single coin from families who had nothing to give. Eli's brow furrowed, and he rubbed the graying stubble on his chin. This didn't sound like any witch he'd ever heard of. It sounded familiar. It sounded like his own mother. He stood up and walked over to a dusty wooden shelf that ran along one wall. He reached for an old, worn leather book, its spine cracked and its pages yellowed with age. The book smelled of dust and wood smoke and memories. It was his mother's journal, filled from cover to cover with her elegant looping script, detailing every remedy, every poultice, every cure she had ever learned or discovered. Eli flipped through the fragile pages, his rough fingers surprisingly gentle, and then he found it. A section on fevers, sage leaves steeped in hot water, another on lung ailments, willow bark boiled and strained, field thyme for aches and pains. They were the exact same herbs Mara had just named, the exact same cures. He turned back to her, his face unreadable. His voice was low but firm, carrying a weight she couldn't yet understand. These are the same cures my mama wrote down in this book. You did nothing wrong. Mara stared at him, her tear-filled eyes widening. In their depths, a tiny spark of hope flickered to life. For the first time on that long, terrible day, she smiled. It wasn't a wide smile or a bright one. It was a fragile, broken thing, but it was enough. It was the smile of someone who had decided, against all odds, that they still wanted to live. Eli sat back down in his heavy wooden chair, the fire he'd just lit starting to crackle and spit in the hearth. Shadows danced on the rough-hewn walls of the cabin. He had cut her down from the rope. He had brought her back from the edge. But he knew deep in his gut that this fight was a long way from over, because men like Sheriff Pike and Reverend Hale, men who built their power on the fear of others, they didn't just let go. They would be coming. And as the night deepened and the world outside grew black and silent, Eli heard it. A faint sound at first, barely audible over the crackling fire, the steady, deliberate crunch of heavy boots on the gravel path leading to his door. Someone was here. Someone was coming for her again. He rose from his chair in one smooth, silent motion, his hand already resting on the cold, heavy iron at his hip. The crunch of boots on the gravel grew louder, closer. Then a sharp, heavy knock rattled the wooden door, a sound that held no politeness, only demand. "Open up, Barrett," a rough voice shouted from the darkness. "We know you've got the witch in there. Hand her over before the good people of this town burn your ranch to the ground." Eli didn't hesitate. He didn't call out. He walked to the door and pulled it wide open. A tall, brutish man stood on his porch, his face twisted into a mean sneer. A long, wicked-looking knife hung from his belt. The man's eyes slid past Eli, darting toward the dark corner of the room where Mara lay, small and weak on the cot. "You got no business keeping her," the man smirked, taking a half-step forward. "She belongs on that rope." Eli didn't waste a single word. His Colt seemed to leap into his hand, the click of the hammer being pulled back unnaturally loud in the night air. He pressed the cold, round barrel tight against the center of the man's chest. The smirk on the brute's face died a quick, sudden death. "You take one more step onto my land," Eli said, his voice as cold and flat as a tombstone, "and you will not live to take another breath. Now get!" The man froze, his eyes wide with a surprise that quickly curdled into fear. He hadn't expected this. He stumbled backward off the porch, his bravado gone, tripping over his own feet as he scurried back into the night, a stream of curses trailing behind him. Eli watched him go, then shut the door and slid the heavy iron bolt into place. He turned around. Mara was staring at him from the cot, her lips parted, her eyes a mixture of awe and terror. You risked everything for me," she whispered. Eli looked at her, his face as steady and unmoving as stone. "No," he said quietly. "I only risked what was already mine to lose." The cabin was quiet again, the only sound the soft snap and hiss of the fire in the hearth, but Eli's mind was anything but quiet. This wasn't the end. It was barely the beginning. That man was just a dog sent on an errand. His masters, Pike and Hale, would not stop. They would keep twisting the truth, keep feeding the town's fear, until every man, woman, and child believed beyond a shadow of a doubt that Mara Quinn was a curse upon them all. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, his voice low and urgent. "If we're going to clear your name," he said, "we can't just run. We need proof. Real proof that they can't deny." Later that night, when the moon was high and the town of Redemption was asleep, Eli saddled his horse. Mara, still weak but filled with a new, fierce determination, climbed up behind him, her hands clutching the saddle horn. They rode out under the cover of darkness, the wind on the prairie sharp and cold against their faces. Their destination was Sheriff Pike's barn, on the edge of his property. If there was a secret to be found, it would be there. And it was. Tucked away under a pile of dusty burlap sacks, they found what they were looking for: barrels of cattle feed, laced with a strange, coarse white powder. On a hidden shelf behind some old harnesses, they found more: glass jars filled with arsenic, the perfect poison to sicken livestock, to foul a well, to create a panic that needed a scapegoat. Eli's jaw set hard, a muscle twitching in his cheek. This was it. This was the proof. But that wasn't the worst of it. Tucked inside an empty crate, almost overlooked, was a thick, leather-bound ledger. Eli opened it. Inside, in Pike's neat, meticulous script, were pages and pages of names. And next to the names, there were numbers. Payments. It wasn't just Pike. It wasn't just Hale. It was the blacksmith, the general store owner, the man who ran the saloon. Half the prominent business owners in Redemption were listed in that book. A cold dread settled in Mara's stomach. This wasn't just about scaring a few people off their land for the railroad. This was a full-blown conspiracy. A shadow council, secretly working together to devalue the entire valley, to create so much fear and misery that people would sell their homes and their land for pennies on the dollar. They weren't just making a witch. They were using her as a smokescreen to hide a crime so vast it was staggering. They weren't just up against two corrupt men. They were up against the town itself. As the weight of that terrifying realization settled over them, a floorboard creaked in the hayloft directly above their heads. Their blood ran cold. They were not alone. Eli reacted instantly. He pushed Mara behind him, his gun already in his hand, pointed up into the darkness of the loft. "Come down," he said, his voice a low growl. "Slow and easy." There was a rustling sound, then the soft scrape of boots on a wooden ladder. A figure emerged from the shadows, descending into the dim lantern light. But it wasn't one of Pike's men. It was a boy, no older than 15, his face pale with terror. It was Jonas, the stable hand who worked for the sheriff. He held his hands up, shaking like a leaf. "Don't shoot," he stammered. "I ain't done nothing." The boy had seen it all. He'd seen Pike and the others meeting in secret. He'd seen them mixing the arsenic into the feed. He confirmed everything they had discovered in the ledger. But then he told them something else, a detail so chilling it made the conspiracy pale in comparison. The poison wasn't just for the cattle. The sour milk and the sick animals were just the beginning. The next step, the one they had planned for the coming Sunday, was to poison the communion wine at Reverend Hale's church. They were going to blame it on Mara's lingering curse, an act of evil from beyond the grave. It would have caused a mass panic, an exodus from the valley that would have left it ripe for the picking. The stakes had just changed. This had gone from a land grab to a plan for mass murder. "We have to get you out of here," Mara whispered, her voice shaking. They had to get this boy to safety. He was their only witness. Jonas, seeing the cold determination in Eli's eyes and the desperate sincerity in Mara's, nodded. He would go with them. He knew staying meant signing his own death warrant. They crept out of the barn and back to the horse. They rode hard, away from the town, the boy clinging tight to Eli. But as they galloped across the open prairie, a strange feeling began to creep up Eli's spine. The night was too quiet. The road ahead was too still. Something was wrong. He reined the horse in sharply, his body tense. His eyes scanned the darkness ahead. And then he saw it. A faint, dark line stretched across the path, almost invisible in the moonlight. A tripwire, an ambush. The world exploded in a flash of gunpowder and sound. Gunfire erupted from the rocks on either side of the road. Pike and his deputies. They had been waiting for them. Someone must have seen them go to the barn. Someone had tipped them off. The night became a chaotic whirlwind of shouting and muzzle flashes. Eli shoved Jonas and Mara off the horse, pushing them toward the cover of a shallow ditch. "Stay down!" he yelled, firing his own pistol back into the darkness. Eli moved with a grim, terrifying efficiency. He wasn't just a rancher. He was a gunman, and a damn good one. Every shot he fired was deliberate, aimed, finding its mark with lethal precision. This was a man who had been in firefights before. Mara, huddled in the ditch with the terrified boy, knew she couldn't just be a victim anymore. As one of the deputies crept closer, his silhouette dark against the starry sky, she scrambled for a rock. It was heavy and rough in her hand. When he was almost on top of them, she rose up and swung it with all her might, connecting with the side of his head. He grunted and collapsed in a heap. They were pinned down, outnumbered. A bullet tore through the sleeve of Eli's shirt, grazing his arm, a hot line of fire. They had lost the element of surprise. The conspirators knew that they knew everything. They couldn't go back to the ranch. It would be the first place Pike would look. They had only one option left, a desperate, reckless gamble. They had to go forward. They had to get to town and force a public confrontation before Pike and his men could hunt them down in the dark and silence all three of them for good. Their only chance was to turn the people against their leaders before the sun came up. Dawn broke with a hard, unforgiving light over the prairie. They reached the edge of town just as the first rays of sun crested the horizon. Eli quickly tore a strip from his shirt and tied it around his bleeding arm. Mara's face was smudged with dirt and gunpowder, her eyes burning with a fierce resolve she didn't know she possessed. The boy, Jonas, was still shaking, but his fear had hardened into a quiet determination. This was it. It was now or never. The town square was already filling with people, their voices a restless, angry buzz. Reverend Hale was already in his place, standing on a wooden crate, his Bible held high in one hand, his other fist punching the air as he shouted, "This girl brought sickness and death to our doorsteps. She cursed your homes. Today we finish what we started. We will purify this town with fire." Sheriff Pike stood beside him, arms crossed over his chest, his face a dark mask of false authority. The crowd was a tinderbox, and Hale was dousing it with gasoline. Then came the sound of hooves. Eli Barrett rode into the square, slow and deliberate, his frame sitting tall and straight in the saddle. Mara was behind him, her hands holding tight to his waist. Every eye in the square turned to watch them as the horse came to a stop directly in front of the crate. Eli swung down from the saddle. He wasn't just holding a small jar of arsenic this time. In his other hand, he held the thick, leather-bound ledger. He slammed it down on the ground for all to see. "This is not witchcraft," Eli's voice boomed across the square, hard as iron. "This is arsenic, poison that was put in your feed and in your water by the men you trust." He kicked the ledger open with the toe of his boot. "And this is the proof, a record of every payment, every bribe. Your sheriff, your blacksmith, your most trusted citizens, all part of a plan to steal your land from under you." A wave of uneasy murmurs rippled through the crowd. The men whose names were in the book began shouting, protesting their innocence. The people were confused, caught between the preacher's fire and the rancher's cold, hard facts. "Do not listen to his lies," Hale roared. "He is blinded by the witch's tricks." But then Eli pulled the boy, Jonas, forward from behind the horse. "Tell them," Eli commanded, his voice low but carrying. "Tell them what you saw." The boy's voice trembled, but it was clear and true. He told them everything. He told them about the meetings in the barn, about the arsenic, about the ledger. And then he told them about the final unthinkable plan. He told them they were going to poison the communion wine. A collective gasp went through the crowd, a sound of pure horror. This was a line that couldn't be crossed. This wasn't about land or money anymore. This was about their souls. The tide of public opinion, which had been a raging river against Mara, began to turn, crashing back against the men who had deceived them. Sheriff Pike, his face pale, saw that he had lost. The game was up, but he had one last, desperate card to play. He didn't deny the charges. Instead, he whirled and pointed a shaking finger directly at Eli Barrett. "You want to believe this man?" he screamed, his voice cracking. "This stranger? This drifter? Then ask him why he was run out of Silver Creek 2 years ago. Ask him about the Barrett curse. Ask him about his mother, the witch who taught him everything he knows." A new, shocking twist. The crowd froze. "He's no savior!" Pike shrieked, his eyes wild with a cornered animal's desperation. "He was driven from his last town under a cloud of suspicion and death. He's one of them. He saved the witch because he's the son of a witch." A stunned silence fell over the square. All eyes turned from Pike to Eli. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Pike's lie about Mara had been exposed, but this new claim about Eli, it had the bitter ring of truth. The doubt came rushing back, thicker and more confusing than ever before. The momentum was gone. Mara's fate, and now Eli's, hung by the thinnest of threads. The silence in the square was absolute. Eli stood like a statue carved from rock, but Mara could see the old, deep pain in his eyes. The sheriff's accusation was true, and the weight of it was threatening to crush them both. Reverend Hale saw his opening and seized it. "The devil recognizes his own," he thundered, his voice regaining its righteous fury. "His very presence in our town is proof of her guilt. He was drawn here by her evil." The crowd, confused and afraid, began to sway again. They were on the verge of becoming a mob once more, a mindless beast hungry for a sacrifice. But then Mara stepped forward. She didn't look at Eli. She didn't look at the angry faces in the crowd. She looked past them, her gaze settling on one person. Reverend Hale's wife, Martha, stood near the back of the crowd clutching a hymn book. She looked pale, her face waxy and unwell. Mara had seen that look before, the slight, almost imperceptible tremble in the hands, the faint blue tinge to the lips. Mara's voice cut through the rising tension, clear and calm. "Your wife is unwell, Reverend," Hale sputtered, taken aback. "What?" "She's sick," Mara said, taking a step closer. "Her heart is weak. She needs willow bark and rest, not fire and brimstone." "Blasphemy!" Hale roared, his face turning a blotchy red. "My wife is in perfect health! How dare you?" But he never finished the sentence. As if on cue, Martha Hale's eyes rolled back in her head. She let out a soft sigh, the hymn book slipped from her fingers, and she crumpled to the ground in a heap. Panic erupted. The crowd surged backward, creating a circle around the fallen woman. The Reverend rushed to his wife's side, his face a mask of terror. He knelt, patting her cheeks, calling her name. He began to pray, his words loud and frantic, but they were just noise. Martha wasn't breathing. Mara didn't hesitate. She pushed through the stunned onlookers and knelt beside Martha, the woman who had watched her be dragged to the hanging tree, the wife of the man who had demanded her death. Mara put her fingers to Martha's neck, searching for a pulse. It was faint, thready. She tilted the woman's head back to open her airway and began to press rhythmically on her chest. "Fetch me water," she commanded, her voice sharp with authority, "and find the willow trees by the river. Break off the youngest branches you can find and bring them to me. Now!" For a second, no one moved. They just stared, frozen in disbelief. Then the old woman whose grandson Mara had saved from a fever pushed her way forward. "You heard her!" she snapped. "Do as she says!" That broke the spell. People scattered, running to do her bidding. In the very center of the town square, surrounded by the people who had tried to kill her, Mara Quinn set about saving the life of her enemy's wife. It was a stunning, powerful act of grace. Eli watched, his gun hanging forgotten at his side. He understood. This was the only proof that mattered. Not ledgers, not witnesses, not accusations from the past. It was the undeniable truth of her gift, on display for the entire town to see. The tension was unbearable. Everything hinged on this one, fragile life. Mara worked with a focused intensity that silenced the entire square. People returned with water and fresh, pliable willow branches. With deft, practiced movements, she used a rock to scrape away the outer bark, getting to the soft, pale layer beneath. She crushed it, steeped it in a cup of water, creating a crude but powerful tea. Martha Hale was still unconscious, her breathing shallow and ragged. Mara gently pried her lips open and trickled the bitter liquid into her mouth, a few drops at a time, stroking her throat to make her swallow. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The only sound was the wind whispering through the silent town. Then Martha coughed. A weak, sputtering sound, but it was a sound of life. Color began to return to her cheeks. Her breathing, while still weak, grew deeper and more regular. She was alive. Mara had brought her back from the brink. The town stood in utter, awe-struck silence. They had not witnessed witchcraft. They had witnessed a miracle of a different kind, a miracle of knowledge, compassion, and courage. Reverend Hale stared down at his conscious wife, then looked at the young woman who had saved her, his face a ruin of shattered certainty. The fire of his hatred was gone, replaced by the cold ashes of shame. He fell to his knees, not to pray, but to weep. The spell was broken. The town's fever of fear and suspicion had finally passed. With a collective roar of righteous fury, the crowd turned on Sheriff Pike and the other men named in the ledger. There was no escape for them. They were disarmed, seized, and bound by the very people they had plotted to betray. Justice, swift and raw and real, had finally come to redemption. Later, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley, Mara and Eli stood on the porch of his ranch house. The town was quiet. Her name was cleared. His past was revealed, but it no longer mattered. "They feared what they didn't understand," Eli said quietly, looking out at the distant lights of the town. "My mother, she was like you, and they feared her for it." "They don't fear me anymore," Mara said, her voice soft. "No," Eli agreed, turning to look at her. "Now they respect you. That's a harder thing to earn, and a much harder thing to lose." He went inside and returned a moment later, carrying the old leather-bound journal. He placed it gently in her hands. "My mother would have wanted you to have this," he said. "It belongs to you now." It was more than a book. It was a legacy, a trust, a promise of a future they would build together here in this town they had saved from itself. Some lessons in this world are carved in wood and stone, but the most important ones, the ones that last, are carved in the hearts of those who have the courage to stand up when everyone else is sitting down. What about you? Would you have turned away in fear, or would you have stood beside her when the rope was tightening? Stories like this remind us that justice often hangs by a thread, and sometimes all it takes is one steady hand to cut the rope. If this story moved you, do me a favor and hit that like button so other folks can find it. And if you want to ride along on more tales of the Untamed West, make sure you subscribe and ring that notification bell. Because out here, every story is a lesson, and every lesson is a chance to choose who you're going to be. And the question that remains is simple. When your time comes, will you?